Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our last Sunday school lesson in the Gospel of Matthew. That's right, we're finishing the book right now. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Jackie Gober, and I'm chair of the Christian Education Committee at Calvary Presbyterian Church here in Willow Grove. We're putting our last Sunday school lessons in Matthew online since we can't gather together in person right now. As I've already said, we've finally come to the end of the Gospel. Last week we left off with Jesus being dead and buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. A guard had been set there, and a large stone was sealed to prevent anyone from going in or out, and it seems highly unlikely that anything would happen to push back the darkness that had prevailed over Jesus. But fortunately for us, God has different plans. Let's read the first 10 verses of chapter 28 to see what happens next. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he has said. Come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." Before we look at what happens in these verses, I want to point out the structure of this section. In some of the commentaries I've been reading, it's pointed out that the last part of Matthew is structured a very deliberate way, something called a chiasm. I won't get into all of the technicalities of that, but this is a literary structure that uses symmetrical ideas to point to a main idea in a narrative. In the end of Matthew's Gospel, we see the chiasm with this passage that I just read at the center. If you look at the two passages immediately before this and immediately after it, you see Jesus being dead and buried, and then the guard being set at the tomb. And then after, we see the guard's report and Jesus alive and reigning. You can see how the actions of the guard alternate on each side of the discovery of the empty tomb, and then the corresponding pictures of Jesus on either side of that. By structuring the passage in this way, and having the empty tomb being the one element at the center without any other corresponding item to it, Matthew seems to be emphasizing the empty tomb and the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. Why this emphasis? I think that Matthew wants to draw attention to this event, to point out its unique place in history. Jesus is victorious over sin and death and all of the powers that put him to death in chapter 27. This fact changes everything and gives meaning to all that Jesus had said and done in his earthly ministry, and should be the center of our focus as we live our lives. Because Jesus is raised, our sin is gone, we are free, and we can move into new life with him. So after the horrific events of Good Friday and the obligatory day of rest on the Sabbath, we see the women come to the tomb in these verses. We read in verse 1 that toward dawn, the two Marys come to the place where Jesus had been buried. Since a new day would have begun at sundown according to Jewish reckoning the night before, and it wouldn't have been light enough for them to go at that point, by waiting till dawn was near, they get up and go to the tomb at the first opportunity that they get. You see them eager and willing to go and serve Jesus in whatever way they could, and it connects to the devotion that they showed in the last chapter. They were the ones that stayed with Jesus the longest, and now their attachment to him remains even after Jesus has been put into the tomb. Another supernatural sign, an earthquake, occurs as they get to the tomb. Unlike the earthquake at the crucifixion, we are told what causes this earthquake. An angel of the Lord has come down from heaven and has rolled back the stone. Matthew tells us that his appearance was like lightning and his clothing as white as snow. This description should make us think of the many appearances of the Lord throughout the Bible. This angel is clearly a messenger from Yahweh, and the fact that the guards fell down like dead men just confirms that fact. You can think of all the times in the book of Revelation that John falls down as though he is dead at the sight of the angels in the visions that he's seeing, for one example of how terrifying it is to be in the presence of the Lord. This angel has a message of reassurance for the women, however terrified the guards are. He tells them not to fear because Jesus has been raised from the dead. They are to observe the place where he was laid, where they saw him laid, and they can clearly see that he is no longer there. Their witness is important, as they could verify his death and burial, and now could verify the fact that he is no longer dead. We are told that the women went away in fear and great joy. I find this phrasing interesting, and it allows us to see just what these women were feeling in this moment. The joy is pretty easy to understand. Their friend was no longer dead, but was alive according to what they just heard from the angel. Of course they would be joyful at this news. The fear, though, is somewhat harder to understand and wrap your mind around. Why would the women fear at the appearance of the angel? Apart from what we know is probably a terrifying appearance because of the guard's reaction. Why would there be fear in the presence of their risen friend? The Greek word that Matthew uses here is phobos, which generally means fear, but could also have connotations of terror or reverence in how it's used depending on the situation. In Matthew's Gospel, when this word is used as a verb, it is used both ways, both as something fearful and something showing reverence. In this passage, though, we are given the noun form twice, which, apart from this passage, is only used one other time in the Gospel. In Matthew 14:26, we are given that noun form again, and the circumstance is that the disciples are crying out in fear, phobos, at the sight of Jesus walking on the water. I think this detail is important for us to understand as we think about what it means for the women to fear as they go away from the empty tomb. As Jesus walked on the water in the earlier chapter, he's displaying his supernatural abilities, which ultimately demonstrate his divine nature. The men in the boat know that they are in the presence of something greater than themselves, but can't quite figure out how to process what they are seeing. In the same way, while the women are certainly overjoyed at the possibility that Jesus is alive, they are fearing the news that Jesus is no longer dead. They saw his lifeless body laid in the tomb. If he truly was alive, what kind of person was he? What does it mean for them to have come close to someone with such power? They know from their Hebrew Bibles that people can't live in the presence of the Lord. He is too holy for us to comprehend and exist in his presence. They experienced this fear as they contemplated their encounter with the divine, and probably thought about their own sinful nature in the presence of the divine that could be coming towards them. But they were not left alone in their fear and joy. Although the angel's words and the sight of the empty tomb were important signs of Jesus' resurrection, there was a further sign that they were going to see. Jesus himself appears to them in verse 9. Their immediate reaction is to bow down and worship him. Like the angel, Jesus tells the women not to fear, but to go forward and tell others of his resurrection. There is nothing for them to fear in his presence. His death has taken away the ultimate barrier between them and God, and they could worship in his presence freely without fear. All they have to do is go forward and testify of his power and resurrection. At this point, after we find out what happens to the women, the narrative switches over to let us know what the guards did after they left the tomb. So in verse 11, we read, "While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." Like the women, they also go and tell what happened. But unfortunately, they don't have a sympathetic audience. It's unclear what exactly they saw at the tomb. We are told that they were afraid, though, so they clearly did not know what to do or how to process the sight of the angel. It's hard to know what they told the religious authorities as well, because Matthew doesn't give us the exact conversation. But why would they go to the high priest, though, if they were under the authority of Pilate? Part of it might do with the fact that if they were found out to have been sleeping on duty, which might be implied with them being described as dead men, they might have just passed out at the sight of the angel. If this were the case, it would result in punishment for them, as sleeping on duty was a capital offense in the Roman army. The high priest, though, and the Jewish authorities give money to them to keep quiet and essentially promise protection to them if what has happened at the tomb reaches Pilate's ears. Matthew explicitly says that the fake story is still in circulation in verse 15. It's striking that the guards have the same evidence of the women, of what happened to Jesus and his resurrection, but they come to completely different conclusions about it. I mean, radically different conclusions. And I think this is one of the themes that we see throughout Matthew's gospel. As Jesus went throughout his earthly ministry, there were radically different reactions to him and his mission. Some people believe him to be the Messiah, others reject him. And this only becomes more dramatic in the last days of his life, and sure serves to show us how important it is to see Jesus through the eyes of faith. It is only once we get past our own natural ways of thinking that we can accept that Jesus was divine and understand his work both in his life and his death. The narrative after this point then switches back to the 11 disciples, whom we are told are obedient to what Jesus had told them to do. Let me read the rest of the gospel. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, All authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age. In Matthew's account of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, we're not given the same details as the other Gospels give. But I do think that Matthew wants to show us the importance of the resurrection and, truncates its details a little bit just to keep what's important there. We're told that when Jesus appears to the 11 disciples, they worship him, but some doubted. What is going on there? The raised Jesus is standing right in front of them. How could they doubt what has happened? I don't necessarily think this is an intellectual doubt about the circumstances of how Jesus was standing in front of them, or whether he was actually standing in front of them, but rather a doubt in being confronted with something that seems so impossible. Jesus was dead, and now he's standing in front of them. It's too good to be true. Are they really seeing this? Can they believe their own eyes? As they're working through this, in verse 18, Jesus tells them that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Through his resurrection, he has come into his full power and has won the full victory in his rising. The disciples were to go out in this power and make disciples of all nations. Jesus' authority was the basis of his command to them, as the task to go out into the world would be impossible in their own power. His power would be with them and give them the ability to teach and preach in his name. Not only would his power be with them, he promises that he will be with them too, until the end of the age. He will neither leave nor forsake them as they go forward in his name. And we know from the book of Acts that this is exactly what has happened. They go out and proclaim his name and bring so many people into the family of God. And these promises aren't just for the 11 men standing there with Jesus. They're there for us too. Jesus has been raised from the dead and is reigning in heaven and is with those who believe in him, empowering them and equipping them to go out in his name and proclaim salvation to the whole world. Think about it. The one who has all authority in the universe is with you and me right now as we proclaim his name and ponder his glory. And I think it's fitting that Matthew ends with Jesus proclaiming that I am with you always. As you may know, I am is a way that the name of God is expressed in the Old Testament, starting in Exodus 3. And every time we hear that coming from Jesus' mouth, we should take notice. Jesus is positioning himself with God, the all-power creator of the universe. But that's not all he's doing with this statement. The fact that he says, I am with you, connects Jesus to even more than just a divine status. In the beginning of Matthew, in chapter 1, the very first chapter, we are introduced to a prophecy from Isaiah 7, where the virgin will bear a son and name him Emmanuel. Jesus is promised to be this child, to be Emmanuel. Isaiah prophesies this child would defeat Israel's enemies and usher in a period of blessing for his people. The Hebrew name Emmanuel means God with us. And I don't think it's an accident that Matthew begins and ends his gospel with a reminder that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. As he went through his earthly ministry, he obeyed and honored God in a way that no human could. And in his death, he bore the sins of his people and carried them away. His resurrection is the vindication of his role as Emmanuel and guarantee that the age of blessing has come. Jesus has defeated the powers of sin and death in rising from the grave, and he extends this power and his presence to us to go forward in his name, proclaiming the resurrection power throughout the world. So as we close out Matthew's gospel, I want to leave you with that thought. Jesus is alive and reigning and with you today, tomorrow, and forever. You and I can go forward in his name, confident that Jesus is risen from the dead. He will be with us as we work for his kingdom. Let me close in prayer. Lord, I thank you and praise you that Jesus is raised from the dead. I thank you that he has conquered sin and death and all of the powers of darkness. I pray that you would give us all confidence that that is true, that we are raised with him, and death and sin no longer have dominion over us, Lord. I pray that you give us confidence of your presence with us and help us to go out in your name to proclaim your glory to those who need to hear it, Lord. I thank you for revealing yourself to us in Jesus, sending him into the world, Lord. And I just pray that you would help us all to know him and the power of his resurrection more and more each day. And I pray this all in your name.